Hello, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. Today's episode is a really fun and interesting conversation with the designer Louise Sandhaus. I first discovered Louise's work a few years ago when she published the book Earthquakes, Mudslides, Fires, and Riots, which is this really great book about the history of graphic design in California that I highly recommend you pick up. It's full of great essays and is a really kind of well-designed graphic design book. Louise also teaches at CalArts in Los Angeles, and we talk a lot about the influence of CalArts on her work, both as a designer and as a teacher. We talk about her interest in critical theory and where that came from and how that has changed her as a designer and how she thinks about design. And we have this really interesting discussion on using form not as an ends in and of itself, but as a way to represent ideas or to think about form as language. And then we talk about, why does so much graphic design look the same today and the role of criticism in kind of parsing some of that out. I really had a fun conversation with Louise. I really enjoyed this and I learned a lot. And I'm so grateful for this conversation. And there's a lot in here. So let's get right into it. Here is my conversation with Louise Sandhaus. I was spending a lot of time this morning thinking about the things that I wanted to talk to you about, and I was really kind of struggling with how I wanted to start this conversation and what was a good way to set it up. And so I was re-listening to your interview with Debbie Millman on Design Matters from a couple years ago, which I think might have been where I first came across your work, to be honest. And you said something in there that was really interesting. And I specifically remember listening to this interview because I had just moved to California a couple months before, and you were talking about the book. And so I was very excited. I didn't know anything about California design at the time. But you said something about, planning to go to Yale, and then you went out to California and you met with Lorraine Wild, and you just kind of felt like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be, kind of thing. And as somebody who a lot of ways, and I feel like so much of this project has been about me trying to figure out what was going on in the 90s, that there was such this critical discourse, and as someone who just missed that, often Yale and CalArts are kind of the two pillars where a lot of that discourse came from. And so I was curious, and I don't mean for you to kind of like pit one against the other, but what was it about kind of arriving at CalArts in the early 90s and thinking this is where I'm supposed to be?
First of all, I want to contextualize this into Boston. So this was in the late 80s. And, I had a modernist education and graphic design, that to me was the language of design. And if you wanted to be a player, that's what you did, And in Boston, it was highly refined, and that's what it was about. It was about a kind of very simple system, very limited palette, and you just did it with such incredible finesse. And, I wanted to be a player. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to play with the boys because that's what it was all about. And if you wanted to do that, you went to Yale.
Okay.
And so, anyway, and what I do, so I had a friend at Yale, so, I was able to go there and visit it. And, it was being on the East Coast, you didn't really know California. You didn't know any other place.
Right.
And, it was sort of early in the sense that the next step in one's career was to go to grad school. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to advance yourself professionally, you went to grad school.
Right.
Now it's more common. In fact, more and more, they're not even designers yet. They're, students seem to be going from undergrad to grad.
Yeah.
So anyway, it just, it just didn't dawn on me that there was anything else beyond Yale to go to for all kinds of reasons. So when I did go out so just to clarify some facts that I didn't go into detail in the conversation with Debbie, but I was put on the wait list for Yale. So so this was a year that a lot of people were applying. And so it's also the year when they know that Alvin Eisenman is retiring, but they don't know who's taking over the program. Mm-hmm. So here I am, I'm waiting to find out whether I'm going to get in that class that year.
Right.
I'm a little anxious about, what the transition is going to be between one director and another, one program director and another. And, feeling like so ready for grad school. I had begun teaching. I could see the handwriting on the wall about a kind of cultural conversation about design.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and also it somehow befriended, I've gone completely blank on her name, over at the MIT Media Lab.
Muriel Cooper?
Muriel Cooper, yeah, she was, I was living in Cambridgeport, and her studio, which was essentially a garage at the time on the MIT campus, or near the MIT campus, I had some conversations with her, and so I could see that computers were going to end up impacting the practice field as well.
Oh, wow.
So, everything was saying it's time for grad school to me.
Yeah.
So that's why I was even looking at that moment. So when I was waiting to figure out what was going to happen at Yale, I just went out to visit a friend who was living in Los Angeles. And when I went to visit Lorraine, and I might have related this story about, I just wanted to see her as a practitioner. I didn't know CalArts. I didn't know what that was. And I didn't know why, when I set up a meeting with her, that she wanted me to meet her there.
Right.
But I did. And she starts showing me around like a prospective student. I thought she misunderstood why I was there. I come to find out, I brought this up to her a few years ago, and she goes, well, it was kind of a ploy.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. So I'm looking around, and everything about the vibe of this place, the work that was going on, the energy of the place, just was shouting to me. It just spoke to me. And I realized that what was inside and why I really was going to grad school was not to get indoctrinated, but to rebel. Mm. And so I recognized my own rebellious spirit when I'm just looking at CalArts. And it was funny because in every respect, it was like that moment of recognition was the moment at which it became the launch pad to everything good that was to happen.
Right.
So, so the biggest thing that happened was that I was, becoming aware of who I was. Mm-hmm. And then the next challenge came after I was accepted at CalArts. And then recognizing that I couldn't start right away. Mm. So, at that point, I was probably about 30, so I was feeling pretty anxious.
Right.
And I was forced to go back to school. for me to go to CalArts, I did have to get within a few credits of my undergraduate degree, and then could complete them at CalArts.
Mm-hmm.
So what it forced me to do was to go back to school. And it was only academic credits that I needed. I didn't need any studio credits.
Oh.
And it was such, I don't, it's like I barely know where to begin to say how important and enthralling that experience was, and just what I needed. So the school that would take me without matriculating, because I could complete the BFA at CalArts, was Mass College of Art. I think the only, if not one of the only, public art schools in the United States.
Oh, okay.
And the strange thing was, that I didn't need studio classes. I was just going to take academic classes there. So it seemed kind of an odd choice, but providential. So there were people there, like this woman, Yasminka Udovicki, who comes from an Eastern, I think, a Yugoslavian family of educators, I think an important family of educators, who had been teaching at BC, at Boston College, and felt like it was teaching at a ski camp.
Yeah.
And so she had switched over to teaching at Mass College of Art, and she had a class called The Intellectual History of Modern Europe.
Oh, wow.
And I think everything that I'm able to think about today or know today is because of the tools that class provided in sort of understanding major shifts of knowledge and thought since the modernity, and I think she sort of placed that around the 15th century. So it gave me a place from which to view the shifts that had caused change, and just shifts in the paradigm. So, and then there were lots of other really important teachers there and experiences, but the best one was I had a friend at the time who was actually teaching at BC, a sociologist, and I went to visit his class and met a woman there who was just sitting in on the class and started talking to her, and she said, "Oh, I actually just go around to all the great schools in Boston and take the classes I'm interested in. I just audit them."
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, wow, that's so cool. And I've been reading this book called Dionysus by Alice Jardine. So I was interested in feminism, and so I thought, wait a minute, she's teaching over at Harvard. I'll just go over there and see if I can just sit in on her class. And she completely welcomed me, gave me, the where to get the readings. And this is all pre-internet, so I had to go to a Kinko's or whatever it was at the time.
That's
buy this
amazing.
Reader that was like 4 inches thick, and a few books, and I didn't come from an academic background, so this was like, oh my God, how do I read this?
Right. Yeah. I know I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's it was like this enthralling world opened up to me. I found out what I was capable of. I got exposed to all kinds of new ideas and challenges, and this woman, this professor, kind of took me under her wing. Like, she thought it was like amazing that a graphic designer of any sort was beginning to critically challenge what they were doing. So after, I don't know, it's like 15 months of going back to school and experiences like that, just the preparation to be able to take advantage of CalArts
Yeah.
couldn't have been more perfect or better.
Yeah. That's so it's so interesting too, because you actually started to answer what my next two questions were going to be. And one of them was, you said, kind of as you were thinking about going back to school, that you were noticing that there was a certain, cultural change happening in graphic design. And then knowing Mario Cooper, you were seeing the computer. But where did that how did you see that kind of cultural shift that was happening, or that interest in theory around graphic design? What were the signs of that you were noticing? And then how did that kind of play out when you were studying back at school?
I don't know what it was specifically.
Yeah.
That was, it may have just been hearing Muriel Cooper talk. And I knew that somehow programming was going to reshape the world and reshape how designers practiced. I guess something in my nature, and again, maybe that was the rebellious nature, was beginning to question, what was going on. The other kind of significant thing that happened, of course, this was, right at the fringe of some kind of amorphous, dawning recognition of cultural shifts. One thing, I started off this conversation talking about Michael Rock.
Yeah.
And he was a friend at the time, and so I'm sure there must have been some conversations with him that might have sparked some kind of awareness at the time, because it wasn't as if there were a lot of people who were talking or thinking critically about design.
Right. Yeah, that's why I was kind of so interested that you were kind of aware of it, or you saw that happening before it, kind of started to truly blossom is interesting.
Right. So the other part of that, and again, going back to Mass College of Art, so when I realized I had to go back to school, I looked at the list of classes that were available, particularly in a kind of continuing studies program. And there was one class, I don't remember the title of it, but it had something to do with postmodernism. And again, this is around 1990, 91.
Okay.
I thought, I don't know what it is about this class, but I think I have to take it, and it sounds really interesting. So I went to register, and they said, sorry, this class is full. I went, okay, all right.
Yeah.
That night, I keep talking about my dreams, but that night, I had a dream that my life would be changed if I took this class.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I called the school the next day and said, I have to take this class. Can I talk to the professor? And they gave me his contact info. And he said, well, of course, if you're that interested, come to the class. So that was, as with the intellectual history of modern Europe, the class that changed my life, the class that sort of became the launch pad of everything I was going to question or think about or get excited about, that was going to shift my thinking, that was going to cause me to see the world in a new way, that was going to cause me to raise questions about the role of design. That was it. This teacher, and I wish I could remember his name, was so astoundingly good in the way that he delivered his lectures, which weren't conventional lectures. It's more like performance.
Yeah.
Same thing, with with Alice Jardine at Harvard. Her lectures were more like performances. So even teachers were trying to reconsider their own pedagogical practices at the time. So when I get to, after that experience and getting to California, that's when I fully realized it wasn't just theory.
Yeah.
In California, this was a postmodern culture. And so, to see that it was, something that where the changes and reorientation that I'd been studying in Boston were the reality of the nature of society and experience in California, or at least in Southern California, where I was.
That's amazing. I did not realize that you had kind of started studying or thinking about kind of critical theory or cultural studies and modernism and postmodernism before you even got to CalArts. Were you before you moved to California and you were taking these classes, were you looking at them or studying them through the lens of graphic design at the time, or did you not kind of make that connection until you had moved?
I think it wasn't until I got to CalArts that it manifested in the work that I was doing.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I knew it was raising bigger questions, the things that I was studying in Boston, but I didn't know, other than to just say this is wrong and that is wrong, and we need to, we need to think more critically. I mean, what happened, you sort of imploded. Whole kind of postmodernism, the conversation had to evolve, otherwise the result was paralysis. You just questioned everything to death, and it was difficult to move forward. And even the work for a while just became kind of, I see two waves of kind of postmodern stylistically. One is the sort of pastiche, but the other, the more, what had started to be the more critical end of it that was taking place in the 80s at Cranbrook, ended up becoming sort of illustrations of those theories, rather than in some way impacting. I mean, it did impact what we did and how we thought about what we did, but at the time it seemed more like illustration.
Yeah. One of my early interviews was with Michael Beirut, and he and I specifically talked about Lorraine Wild's essay Castles Made of Sand, where I feel like she starts talking about, she essentially compares modernism and the idea of modernist graphic design to a fraternity, where these sets of rules that you don't challenge, and if you do challenge them, you're kind of an outsider, or like that you're doing it wrong. And so I think it's interesting that you were a student there basically as those rules were really being challenged. How did that change your design work or your design process as you started kind of immersing yourself in making work with all of these new kind of ideas bubbling up inside of you?
Well, I'm trying to think, I think it probably impacted the content of the work, the subjects that I was addressing. I remember this kind of early project where we had to deal with kind of the new terminology of design, and to the kind of vocabulary that a postmodern program, a critical postmodern program, would incorporate and use as within the conversation to analyze and discuss the work. So I had metaphor, so each student was given 3 different terms, and in some ways had to represent those terms, I think, typographically and in terms of images only, and then a combination of the two.
Okay.
I had metaphor, metonymy, and I don't remember what the other term was, mimesis or something. Irony. Irony was the other thing.
Interesting.
So I remember I think it was for either irony or metaphor. I had used the fireworks, fireworks celebration, showing celebration, but it was confused with the the bombs, weaponry going off. This must have been around the time of Kuwait.
Yeah.
And so, it was a confusion. It was about the confusion of what you were looking at.
Okay.
And it was hard. You couldn't really distinguish whether you were looking at, fireworks sort of a celebration like 4th of July or, these kind of bombs going off. The imagery was pretty identical. So, it did seem like it affected it there. I think my work became more playful. It was clear that my palette was still a modern palette.
Right.
And I remember the struggle to try and adopt a more kind of,
right,
I'm like a sort of more messy, vernacular, postmodern. But I realized now, of course, that I was trying to imitate that palette. It wasn't in my nature.
Right.
My gifts are in other realms than the formal ones, and I'm kind of I use the palette I have to do what I can do.
Yeah.
And what I learned from that is that form is language.
Right.
And it's why I feel still so committed, even though, I think we're just coming out of a period, I hope we're coming out of a period where the fashion is a more restrained palette.
Yeah.
That form allows us to think. And, if we don't have forms that can represent and can help us think through and understand new ideas and knowledge, we're pretty fucked.
Right.
So it's why I now embrace, understand, and try and inspire students to play with visual form, not as an end in itself, but because it gives them the facility and tools to be able to represent ideas for which there is no form for them to be understood and communicated.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was reading, also as I was preparing for this interview, I was reading about a class that you teach, or that you did teach, I don't know if you still do, called Mutant Design.
Yeah.
Which it's, from what I understood from reading, it was this kind of cross-disciplinary thing where there's kind of all of these things coming together. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that a little bit, because it sounds kind of like what you're talking about, of using design to kind of think about these ideas, and seeing design almost as a way of kind of making your thinking visual, in a sense. Kind of.
So the Mutant Design classes, when I was still at the Jan van Eyck in Holland, I was hired to teach part-time at CalArts, and somehow I think they were interested in expanding, bringing in more media and more ideas about other forms of media than print into the program. So I became sort of like the person talking about computers. And of course, when I was in Holland, I did a second postgrad there, what's equivalent to a grad education. They would what they postgrad in Europe. So I have two thesis projects in that thesis project there. Both were about design education, but that one there concentrated on how the computer was going to impact design and design pedagogy. So I sort of became attached to that area. So when I went to back to CalArts now to teach, it was to bring in that conversation. So the mutant design classes were really exploring how graphic designers, might think about their contributions. How they might think about these new arenas or platforms. And luckily, I think it was pretty quickly after I got to CalArts as a faculty member that we received that we became part of the Apple Design Project, which was something that happened in the 90s, where the head of their advanced technology group had initiated this project, I think quite wisely, to reach out to, I think it was maybe 11 institutions a year across the world, where they would provide mentors, a couple of mentors, and there'd be a themed project. And then at some point towards the end of the semester, everybody would convene in Cupertino at Apple headquarters and work, kind of charrette for several days on a presentation. So it was kind of each school participated for 2 years. So in the 2 years that we were participating, the mutant design class essentially was working on that project. So one was, I think, the future of libraries, and I think one was the future of the book.
Oh, wow.
So it seemed like a natural evolution for graphic designers to kind of think through ideas about a repository, to think through the idea of reading and encountering the reading experience and how computers might impact that. I mean, this is still, reasonably early on in that. And so, and to have, mentorship and some guidance from Apple was pretty significant. So it was kind of ideal, the questions particularly raised. What it did for me, and I think this kind of remains an awareness and interest, is that when I was at Apple headquarters during I think the first year of our project, I was in the advanced technology offices, and I saw somebody's name tag on their door, and it said, I can't remember the name of the person, but it said typographer. And so I just knocked on the door and I asked this person about, like, what were they doing as a typographer in the advanced technology group. And it turned out that they were a linguist, and that what they were thinking about was the encounter of, like, reading and words and language.
Oh, wow.
And, in other words, the shaping of ideas in written thought.
Yeah.
And I thought, and then that was another big light bulb that went off, because I realized, that is what typography is. It's the shaping of thought. And so that just shifted my consciousness about typography and what it was. Conversation suddenly to be able to have with students, about the impacts of technology in the, in the shaping of thought, just kind of opened the way for students to experiment with that realm as graphic designers. So because, where does that situate in a curriculum?
Yeah.
That's why those classes that was the trajectory of these classes that were labeled mutant design. It was always mutant design, the future of the book, or mutant design, the blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That's where that came from. So there's still, now it's, it just sort of pervades everything that we try and do at CalArts. We try to be, media agnostic in theory, not in practice. But I still think the sort of challenges and questions are still there. So the spirit of the mutant design classes remains, even if the actual classes might have dispelled.
That's something I've been thinking about a lot that I hadn't fully connected until you started describing that. Something, I feel like my undergrad kind of design education was very much in the spirit of the modernists, and it was, grid systems and colors and forms and shapes and how to make a nice layout. And I didn't really, and I'm not saying this to kind of put down my undergrad education, but I never learned any kind of design theory or heard about typography described the way you just described it. And all the projects were, the form was decided first, and then you design for that. Design a poster, design a book, and then in web design, you design a website. How do you, and this is something I've been thinking about as I've been working on this project and thinking about how people talk about design and that connection to how design is taught. How do you teach design in that kind of way? I get that's kind of a big question. I don't know how to simplify that a little bit, but how do you kind of inject that kind of theoretical, kind of critical look that's so central to your own work to your students?
Well, okay, so a few things. We have to separate grad education from undergrad education.
Yeah.
So these classes were mainly oriented towards the grad students.
Okay.
So I do want to clarify that. That said, there's two things here. One is, I would say, what's now more readily understood is that design has to be taught as context-based. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the teaching of typography, if you orient it from the point of view of context rather than, skill and mastery, that's, right. That reframes the type question. Now, this also becomes complicated by teaching itself. And this is, so the, design education in America, which, Kathy McCoy has looked at, the Swiss design education in America, and that took hold, in part took hold because there was a practical pedagogy, that could be passed on, that educators could measure,
right.
judge whether it was successful or not, it became easy. So, I don't want to critique anybody teaching typography from, the letter to the word to the sentence to the paragraph. Because I understand and I get it. At the same time, and I also want to say I don't and haven't taught typography. I mean, I think I taught it for maybe 2 semesters. It's not my area. So, I'm speaking theoretically, not practically. But I am intrigued with Denise Gonzalez-Chris' book. On typography and context, because she does frame it that way. And she looks at typography not as a kind of, it's about, well, as somebody said to me recently, it's from the user point of view rather than the typographer point of view. And that maybe, it really is about not mastery, but thinking about, reading in different contexts and how diverse that is, not just platforms, but environments, and functions, that's the starting point. And also, the issue of taste is another complex issue, taste and meaning. So all of that, I think are factors in sort of orienting typography. And I guess the other thing I was going to say about the way that Denise is approaching this is, she says that you go on, some people may go on to become typographic masters. But for undergraduate students who are learning to function as practitioners with essential competencies, that they have to be able to use typography, and if that's their concentration, to become masters of it. That becoming masters is the next step.
So much. This leads in exactly to the next question that I wanted to talk to you about, because so much of this podcast for me and so much of the things that I'm kind of working on and thinking about are how we talk about design, and specifically, like, what do we talk about when we talk about graphic design? And I think I kind of started this project a little bit kind of against this idea of, and I feel like I've said this in so many of the interviews also, but against this idea of a company redesigns their logo and then everybody kind of rushing to judgment of whether it's better than the old one, or complaining about, the kerning on the new logo, or why did they pick this color, to these kind of deeper questions about the context, about why there's a logo redesign. And I'm just using logos as an example, but any type of design, that's often how design is talked about, is at that purely surface level. What are kind of like issues or topics that you see kind of in the current design discourse that need to be talked about more, or should be kind of examined more? And I think you have an interesting perspective as someone who's kind of worked through the 90s and saw the computer coming and the discourse around that, saw the internet and then the discourse around that. What's kind of happening now that needs to be talked about past that kind of surface mastery kind of, aesthetic level?
That's a big one.
I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, the question I ask my theory students are, to just think about, and maybe attempt to answer is like, why do things look the way they do? And I can't help but being obsessed with why do they all look the same? And that to me is like scary, because of the homogeneity of it, and because of our conversation a few minutes ago. It means that if form is the the sort of the representation of knowledge and ideas and thoughts, it seems like everything is looking pretty narrow. So, hopefully that question, why do things look the way they do, opens up a crack.
Right. That's interesting.
Because it seems like everything is sort of seamless right now. And so it seems like just opening up that crack to be able to become aware of how seamless it's all become and how homogeneous and how, it seems like the values that are driving the work are narrow. But, it seems like what are the drivers, or what are we pushing against?
Right, yeah.
All seem to be the big question of the moment. In fact, we just had, in the last few days, we've had Andrew Blauvelt, Paula Scheer, and Jonathan Barnbrook at CalArt.
Oh, wow.
And it was interesting, the sort of overlaps, particularly, Paula Scheer and Jonathan Barnbrook, both sort of talking about, kind of mediocrity, how, this kind of comfort level in kind of mediocrity. But, I think everybody knows, or two things that they were saying, I wouldn't say everybody knows, is that you have to push against something. You have to feel angry, or you are feeling some kind of passion to speak about something of consequence. But other than, Trump is horrible,
right.
It seems hard to get beyond that.
Yeah. And it's so... I've been thinking a lot about, there's this certain aesthetic now that's kind of comes to mind when people say critical graphic design or, speculative design. It now has this certain look to it. And I feel like that ties exactly into it, where it's like, if we're going to do something that's critical design or design criticism, it has to look like this. And then it's just falling back into the same traps that, we fell in with modernism or postmodern. It was all about just kind of giving the appearance of being a certain way instead of asking, why is it that way? And then even more, why does everything just look the same in general?
Right.
I have just two more questions just to kind of wrap it up. And I kind of wanted to tie it back to your book about California design. And the two questions, I'll give them to you both at the same time, and you can kind of pick what you're interested in or maybe how they, whatever one is easier to answer first. But I'm interested in how writing and the process of writing fits into your design practice. And then the second part of that question is, how did the act of writing your book and researching that book change you as a designer or change the design that you've been working on since it came out?
The minute you said writing, I could just, it's like, I just like relive pain, agony.
No. Yeah.
It is probably the thing throughout my career I most wanted to and want to be able to do well.
Yeah. Me too.
Otherwise, you're locked into yourself.
Yeah.
And two, it's like, okay, how can you make the contribution that you want to make? And three, how can you wrangle and be challenged with your own ideas?
Right.
So like writing is crucial and agonizing at the same time.
Yeah.
I admire people who are gifted in that realm, and I can see it. I can see it in their writing. Mm-hmm. Those who have it's almost as if there's no separation between their brains and what comes out of their hands.
Yeah.
And then me, who's just like, right, and then I have to look at it and go, that makes no sense. I don't know what I'm saying here. Yep. And so, again, it becomes a kind of like tool But, I think like any writer, you realize that writing writes you. You don't necessarily write writing. It's not like you're just pouring out your thoughts.
Yeah.
Your thoughts are being shaped by your writing, and you begin to see what you're thinking in the writing, and you are forced to answer the question of what am I saying here? What am I trying to get at here?
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, but it's not, it's a parallel process to designing as well.
Yeah. My last question was kind of how the book, changed you or changed your design work since then in the act of researching that and going through that agonizing process of writing. Did that filter back into your work at all? Into your kind of design work?
So it, okay, so I learned a number of things. I'm going to talk about it in terms of like learning,
Okay.
what I became aware of, the impacts. So I learned how much I appreciate, value, and just recognize the significance to what I do to have amazing collaborators. So, the book had a lot of collaborators on it, students, particularly the person working with me at the time, Derek Schultz, who's now at the New York Times, the conversations that he and I would have and the things he would create out of that conversation. The diagrams that I did with Kat Catmuir and Ben Woodlock, just shaping those, and the conversation I would have with them, and the struggle to figure out the form that those would need to take, just amazing delight, just that the thing, that sort of seesaw that is not only about delight but about play, and it results in the most satisfying outcomes. And that book is a result of those collaborations. The other two people that were sort of vital was the publisher, Diana Murphy at Metropolis, who just held, even when I was like, oh, what am I doing here? She held the vision, so she served like a kind of the creative bastion. She held that vision for me, even when I was sort of like wavering a bit, thinking I needed to go off in a slightly different direction.
Yeah.
So that was sort of vital. And the other person was Ann Thompson, my editor, who I call, my Vulcan mind meld.
Yeah.
So that's what we did. She was the voice in my head saying, now what were you trying to say here?
Yeah.
What's another way we could put that? So those were vital people. So I do want to acknowledge the dispersal of credit,
right.
And how that made me sort of aware of the sandbox I want to play in. So the other thing about the book that were sort of lessons or things that I took away was, of course, a kind of confidence, in how I did, ultimately play to my strengths, and recognize what those were and the story I wanted to tell and how I wanted to tell it, what I think was necessary. Like, for instance, my interest in other forms of design history writing, that it didn't just need to be scholarly in its approach. That's not at all to say that scholarship isn't significant. It is. It's just the voice that's used, and the kinds of techniques or methods. The most radical in the book being Denise Gonzalez Crisp fiction that brings together women who are not physically in the same space, nor in terms of the time in which they were working, and to bring them all together to sort of measure what conversations they might have and what they share in common, was an interesting device. So you have Lorraine Wild, who did 2 essays, and Michael Worthington and Denise, all doing very different kinds of, or utilizing different kinds of approaches to reveal historical information and viewpoints. And then, recognizing that, that people look at images, and the images needed to make the argument themselves, and that they needed to be contextualized as if, like anything you present, it's the context that makes it, that buoys it. And so, thinking about the individual design of the presentations, and that the text was, that people could like dip into it, that they didn't need to read this in a kind of linear way. All of these, everything was specific to all the decisions that were made about the content and the types of content, were meant to provide different ways of thinking about and perspective and interpretations, and to show that there were different ways to have these interpretations of this work and its significance and what it was saying. So all of that led to this next big project that I've been working on since the book, and again with many important team members. And this initiative is called Making History.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So what I realized from the book, another sort of pain point of the book, was the stuff that didn't get in it. So it wasn't, and was never meant to be, a compendium. Or a survey. It's not all the important, so-called important graphic designers. It's not meant to be a canon. And what I realized is that there's a lot of work that is ending up in trash cans. That our history is actually disappearing because there are not enough researchers or scholars to actually, or archives to actually preserve this work. So our history by the second is sort of disappearing. So I wanted there to be more material that was preserved, and more ways of, just kind of providing a collection / archive that others could be inspired to make something of it, to interpret it how they saw its relevancy. So Making History is a tool platform for a virtual collection of graphic design that's crowdsourced.
I love that. I think that's so exciting. I think that's the perfect, I know you have to head out soon, so I think that's like a perfect way to kind of wrap this up. Thank you so much for talking with me. I thought this was a lovely conversation. I feel like I learned so much. I really appreciate your time.
Well, I really, really enjoyed this conversation as well. So thank you.
This episode was recorded on February 15th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.